All right, this is part 2 of the full A-body suspension rebuild. We'll go over all the rear suspension components, and we'll start replacing with the upper control arms. So here's what's been done already off video. Basically, I just jacked the car up under the differential there. We jacked the car up at that point, so everything was jacked up evenly. I put jack stands under the frame on both sides just for safety. I do have my calipers removed. I've been doing some work on the brakes. This is a Right Stuff brake kit. I'll go into that in another video. So what we're looking at replacing here is these Edelbrock tubular upper control arms. Can't say there's anything wrong with them, but I'm just doing a full upgrade and doing roto joints in the rear differential. And then these are stock lower control arms, which have never been replaced. We're gonna be adding a sway bar, which we haven't had. And then these are Hotchkiss lowering springs in the back. Those are about 2-inch, I would say. As well as these adjustable QA1 shocks. So this is what we'll be working on. All right, so the hardware that I'm using, I do have a totally stainless hardware kit for my rear suspension. So they have a bolt head that's 9/16, and a nut on the nut side is gonna be a 3/4. I'm gonna use a ratchet or impact gun on one side and a wrench on the other. I'm not sure if the rear end being higher or lower is gonna make this easier or not, but I'll make a mention if I notice one way or another, and I'll go ahead and remove that now. Just an update on this. I didn't find any benefit whether the rear end was higher or lower. When it is lower though, it does make this easier to access, so I will say lower may be the way to go, but not completely down so that you don't have the most amount of tension pulling against this control arm. I did here, and this is sticking through. I did get the nut off, and then I put the nut on a few threads, and then I would smack the nut with a rubber mallet just to help tap it out. Then once the nut was all the way against the control arm, I took the nut off, so it's sitting there. I tapped it through, and then I used a thinner, this is actually an LS head bolt, and I pushed it all the way through. So I did have to tap it out, and that's how I did it. To disconnect and lift that up, I'm sure you could use a rubber mallet on the underside or just push it. I wasn't sure how hard it would be. So I did put a towel under here, and I pried it up this way. I pried up with a pry bar. I didn't want to scratch my powder coated rear end, and I also don't want to be on top of these stainless brake lines and pinching those. So I did go underneath. Okay, now I'm gonna move to the other bolts on that side. Again, it's gonna be a 3/4 socket on one side. I'm actually gonna use a 3/4 inch nut on, wrench on the other side because it's a nut in small space. On this side, I'll use the 9/16 impact socket just to quickly pull that out, and then I'll hopefully be able to use the same tapping method, or I'll pry from this side, or maybe the drill will just actually run it out with some pressure against it on the other side. Okay, I'm actually noticing that my exhaust hangers aren't all the way tight, but I'll address that later. What I did do is I put a 9/16 hex head on here, and I tried to use an extension to come all the way out here with an impact gun through the shock in the wheel well, but I was losing power with the extension. So what I did is I got under here and put a 1/2-inch drive, laid on my back, and I was pushing up, so I had a lot of force. And then I have a wrench 3/4 on the back side, just holding that still, letting it kind of wedge up against the frame. I was able to break it loose, so now I'll go ahead and try and hit it with the impact gun to get it off quickly. All right, so the impact gun did work perfectly with the extensions after I broke it free. Drove it right out, and the bolt came out super easy. I was able to slide the bolt out with my hand. So now I'm just basically wiggling, pulling this out, and we have one of the upper control arms removed. This would be all you need to do, and then install the new ones. But for me, we're gonna do roto joints, so we'll actually have a big pain in the butt problem of getting these bushings out and getting the roto joints in. That'll be next. All right, full disclosure, this may be unrealistic, but I'm gonna tell you how I did this. This is the bushing pressed into the differential housing, or the rear housing. Basically, this is pressed in to here, and then this metal sleeve is pressed into the housing. I was able to actually tap. I was smacking it pretty good, which was pretty hard to get space to do, but I was swinging a hammer behind it, smacking this, and it actually started moving outwards. I was being careful not to mushroom the other side edges to where it wouldn't be able to slide through the housing, and I started tapping the middle, and then this shot out. These are actually coming out pretty easy just tapping it, because I did install these brand new probably within the last few years, I think. Right after I powder coated the rear end, so that might have made it easier to get them back out. But what people have done is use a drill bit and drill a bunch of this out, and then just basically mangle and get this out. Another thing that they do, I think there's a tool, some people use a torch, being careful about fuel lines, of course. And then the method I was going to use, but I don't have a long enough bolt laying around, I actually have a ball joint removal tool, and you can rent them too. But basically, there's a bigger ring for this, but I had slid the bigger ring over, and then I had a bolt going through one side with a washer to push it this way, and I was going to put a nut on this side with the this guy right here. So this sits on that ring, and then on this side, and then I was going to put a nut on this side, and basically it would be basically pushing or pulling it through out of the housing into that cup. So that's one way to do it. I don't know if you could visualize that. But yeah, so what I'm doing now is I have this on the back side of this lip, and I'm just going around tapping it evenly, and this is actually coming out, so that will get that out for me. All right, and we're out. It's coming out of the housing. Some tapping on the back side. You could see where I was hitting back and forth. You could see also what I meant about trying not to mushroom. So you can see it stayed pretty straight. It didn't really flare out to where it would catch and not let it slip through. Maybe angling your hammer towards the bushing makes it mushroom inwards instead of outwards, so it doesn't get locked. And then this is the bushing. So just like this, like that. And what I mean is hammering this way so that it mushrooms in. If you hammer on it like this way, then it's gonna mushroom out. And once that bends out that way, you won't be able to pull it through the housing as easy. It'll almost look like this side does. And that's it. All right, so here are the instructions from UMI for the Roto-Joints. These are the bushings going into the top of the rear end. Here it shows you the directions on how this is supposed to be installed. This is actually already installed for you. This is pre-assembled Roto-Joint. Really, this ring is the only thing that comes separately. You can see that here. There's two of these. And then what it's telling you to do in the figure here is that you're still going to press this in the same direction. So if you remember how we just pressed it out toward the rear wheel, we're going to press it in from the same direction. What it's saying is to put this socket here, and then a 32 or maybe even slightly bigger would be better. This is the biggest I have laying around, and this is what it actually calls for. The 32 is big enough to not be pressing against this inner ring and just press against the outer. If you line it up right, it should be good. What this is gonna do is basically they're saying to just hammer this thing in. What they're saying not to do is not to hit this. So luckily this socket is tall enough that it's not resting up against this. You don't want to be hitting this, and you don't want to be hitting this. If you do, you'll damage the internals and have premature failure, if not just damage upon installation. On the instruction side, this is just saying how to remove it, the drill bit method or the torch method. This is saying to install it, use the socket, don't tap the Roto-Joint. Like I just said, you'll damage it. Let's see, once the new Roto-Joint is installed into place and fully seated, install the spiral bearing ring onto the groove of the bushing. So that means here. Oh, I see. It's a spiral, so I think you could spread it and you can get it up over and onto this. Just read through the rest of the instructions. Basically, once you get it installed, this is saying to take this ring, which is it's kind of like a spring, and it does separate, kind of like a key ring, and they want this to go on here. So since this is pressing in this way, this ring will go on here. That'll ensure that this is locked into place, kind of like a C-clamp, if you will. I believe that's what this is mentioning to do. And then once this is installed, it does say, you will install this dry, I believe. It does say, though, that you can grease either side of this to get your control arm. It says to basically swivel the control arm back onto the housing. In this case, we're replacing the whole control arm. So we'll just actually put the new one on. The grease will just help sliding it onto here. And that'll be it for this. It does mention that you may need to tighten up your bolts and nuts here occasionally, just to make sure that there's still pressure against the roto joint as it kind of breaks in. All right, I was able to tap this in just using a hammer. I will say that the 32 is pretty tight, so you do want to be careful. Let me turn the brightness up. Here we go. You do want to be careful here because the 32 can line up with the roto joint, so you don't want this to be at an angle where it's pressing in. As long as you keep it flat, you should be safe. And then I would just tap as evenly as you can. It's kind of difficult, but as easy as you can, tap this in. You know, it did start to go in one side a little bit more. It'll go in a little unevenly, but it'll start to smooth out. Just kind of stop and pay attention to how it's going in. If you see one side is going in a little bit more, try to focus your hammer hitting on the side that maybe needs to catch up. So I got that in all the way. Let me get the clip on there next. This clip is kind of like a coil spring. I'm basically gonna just start it on one side and spin it until it goes on. So I'll start one side into the groove, kind of like a keychain. Spin it into place, just like that. I was able to get the ring on. Basically, I started it on just like I said, like a keychain. What you do have to do is kind of pull the ring outward and push it around. So you're kind of pushing it out so that it goes around. It's wrapped really tight, so it's actually pretty tough to you can't just turn it like I thought you would. You kind of have to stretch it a little bit without bending it too much or twisting it. You are going to have a little bit of an issue. This is a 12 bolt factory we're in. Right here, it's hard to see, but that ring is a little bit wide and it touches the housing, so it's hard. You can't really get it to sit, to go down, and you can't really get it to press into that groove. So what I did is I put a flathead up against it right there, and I just tapped it really lightly with a hammer and a flathead, and I was able to wedge it into this space here and get it to clip in to the groove all the way around. So I just tapped it just to make sure it went all the way and seated. And this is really actually it. This is complete here now. So these do move pretty easily. You can kind of just barely tap it with like a hammer or something, and these will move. I imagine I'll have to tap these to the right angle, so that way when I push the control arm down, it sits just right. All right, that is a wrap for part 2 of this series. Stay tuned for the next parts of this series on the rear suspension build. We'll have the control arm installation and removal, as well as coilovers coming up next. Remember, please do like and subscribe. As long as I helped one viewer there, I'll keep the content going. Thanks, guys.